Welcome to Monster Chats, presented by Monster VoIP, where we share the tools, methods, and best practices that business leaders use to build new connections, strengthen relationships, and impact sales in organizations of all shapes and sizes. If you have any questions that come up during today's episode, please text them to 424-378-6966. Please welcome the founder of Monster VoIP, your host, Colin Mitchell.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking with Mark Metry, the best-selling author of Screw Being Shy. Mark and I are going to be talking about social anxiety, mental health, and how sharing your authentic self with others online and off can make the world a difference. I'm Colin Mitchell, the host of Monster Chats and the founder of Monster VoIP. Mark Metry is a best-selling author of Screw Being Shy. Learn how to manage social anxiety and be yourself in front of anyone. He also hosts one of the world's top 100 podcast, Humans 2.0, exploring mental health and self-development in today's environment. Mark, welcome to Monster Chats.
Colin, dude, thank you so much for having me on, and it's been great to connect with you here on Zoom ever since staying to date on LinkedIn. So it's been awesome, man, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, awesome. Tell us, the intro tells us a lot about, kind of who you are, but tell us something a little bit deeper about yourself. Tell us something, I know you're pretty much an open book, but tell us something people might not know.
Yeah, man. So basically for the first 18 years of my life, I literally tried to spend every single second trying to hide and escape from people because I didn't want people to know the truth about who I was and my problems. And that is because every single time that I have had to talk throughout my entire life, my brain would tell me to shut up, to stop talking. It would trigger a fight or flight response where all of a sudden I would feel my heartbeat and my forehead sweat and tell me I'm going to die if I talk to this person, which affected every single area of my life, from my relationships to sports to clubs. I had no friends growing up. And so today I literally do the opposite of that. Today, literally every single day, I try to spread my story, my movement, the problems that I have gone through, because, a lot of people tell me like, hey, aren't you shy to kind of share about these things? And I obviously think there's a thin line of like, you don't need to spread all your problems on the internet, but it's also like with problems specifically related to mental health, where they've been largely invisible for the entire world. Like, you could, if someone breaks their leg, or they have heart problems, you can see that they have a pacemaker, or you can see that they have a wheelchair. But if somebody has a broken brain, we don't really perceive them in the same way. And so I kind of went through that, and I'm just trying to push this message, whether it's through a book, whether it's through like this Amazon Prime documentary series that I'm on, whether it's me bringing input, the fact that I'm on a board of an education nonprofit, and all the other things that I do. I'm always trying to spread this message because when I was 15, 16, I became financially independent. And previously up to that point, I had never had probably more than $20 in my pocket. My parents immigrated here from Egypt. They came here with $200, grew up on government housing, food stamps. Mm-hmm. And when I experienced that, I thought that all my problems were going to go away once I had a ton of money. And if anything, I wasn't really sure about myself. They got worse. And I've had people on my podcast, from the co-founder of Netflix to, billionaires, that tell me like, hey, when I had X $100 million in my bank account, I was going to kill myself. And so after like hearing all the stories, after going through my own life, after doing what I do for a living, this is something that I've made like my number one purpose, at least for now, because this problem is not going away. And especially because of what's happening right now in the world, I think if anything, it's going to get worse, unfortunately. And so I'm trying to be just someone who can actually do something for someone. And so whether that's through the book or my LinkedIn or whatever, or my business, I'm just trying to push that out there as much as possible, man.
Yeah. Awesome. Tell me about that moment at, 15, 16, when you became independent. Like, you probably thought you'd feel like you arrived, right? But it doesn't sound like that was the case.
Yeah, man. So it's crazy. And like for me, I ended up going to school. so when my parents first moved to America, we moved in like sort of like a city area. And so a lot of poverty, a lot of, a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different races, a lot of diversity. And we ended up, as my parents kind of got better jobs, we moved out of the city and we moved out into a more rural area. And we lived in this small town with like 5,000 people. And the really interesting part about this town was there was no racial diversity whatsoever. And so, and also I didn't really have money at that time, while this town, its socioeconomic status was much higher. Like this was probably the first time in my life where like on my bus route, I was seeing mansions and I was seeing cars for the first time. And so the really interesting part was, this was also post 9/11 in America. And so if you were a Middle Eastern, you got destroyed. And so for me, when I was a kid, I faced a lot of racism, a lot of extreme racism, abuse, bullying. I had some health problems growing up, and these kind of put me in like this, it really began the development of the onset of my social anxiety, where I just stopped talking to people. And as a result of that, I started to hustle online. I had a YouTube channel in like 2010. I was launching all these websites. I was making apps when the iPhone came out. I was doing all these different things. And one of my ventures got successful and I got lucky, and I was making 6 figures, basically automated, like mostly all profit. And when that happened, because I had grown up without money, because everywhere I had looked, people next to me were wearing Jordans and designer clothing, but I would wear the same clothes to school every day. It really almost like it confused me. Like you said, like I thought I was supposed to arrive. I thought I was supposed to reach this destination of happiness, the American dream of where all my problems go away. And that is fake. That's complete BS. And so that kind of led me to really being like really confused in my life for a few years. But ultimately, I'm really glad that it happened, because it made me prioritize the real importance of what it is that I'm talking about today, or else I would be one of like those other, super successful 22-year-olds that just like models in front of cars and takes pictures with chicks, because that is so empty.
Yeah, we have enough of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, but
yeah. So tell me, like, what's your story? Like, how did you get over, being shy or like improving your mental health? Like, walk us through, like, from, because there's so many people who probably relate to how you felt, right? But like, what were like the small steps that like led you, to overcoming some of those challenges?
Yeah. So, to back up here, I remember throughout my life, I was always called an introvert or a quiet kid. Oh, Mark is just the quiet kid in the back of the classroom. My parents at parent-teacher conferences, it would always tell me that. And when you actually look at like the definition, the psychology definition of being an introvert is defined as somebody who, the way that their brain works, the way that their brain has a tendency to do so, they're more predominantly focused on their internal world, their thoughts, emotions, feelings, and they get energy from that. It's like being introspective. It comes from being an introvert. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And if you know how to harness that, that's a superpower. There's a lot of successful people who are introverts. And when it comes to being shy, I also think that it's totally normal and natural to be shy depending on the situation. So like if you're doing something new for the first time, if you are maybe going to like a party or an event and you don't know anybody and you're going by yourself, it's totally okay to be shy like for the first like section or first hour of that. But there are people who not randomly end up becoming socially anxious, which is every room they walk into, no matter who they have to talk to, they are shy. And if that happens long enough, then their brain and body form this feedback loop of fear and stress that essentially traps somebody in their own brain where they could be a social person, but their nervous system is still freaking out about social interactions. I know extroverts who have social anxiety. And so social anxiety is something that happens specifically. It's not something random. And I remember for me, I didn't actually think about this because a lot of times if you talk to someone who has anxiety or depression, especially when they were a kid and they were facing these issues, a lot of them actually have memory problems too, because they've suppressed a lot of memories, a lot of stories that have happened to help themselves live. And so when I was 18 and I went to college, I actually realized for the first time that I had social anxiety. Previously, up to that moment, I had no idea what was going on. I thought that there was just something inherently wrong with me. I thought that there was something wrong about like my character. I thought that I was just born as like a failure. And when I realized I had social anxiety, which happened from me going to my first college party and drinking alcohol and getting drunk and experiencing alcohol's social inhibition
Yeah.
effects, I was able to walk up to any guy, any girl, and just speak my mind. And I had never been able to do that in my entire life. And so I remember the next day I was just like, wait, like, why have I never been able to do that throughout my entire life? And so that was like that, like experiencing the contrast of that moment enabled me to realize that my nervous system was just retracted in this way that in my day-to-day life, I just couldn't talk to people. And so eventually, like, this actually made the problem worse. And I realized that I sort of had this problem. And instead of me trying to manage it, learn more about it, try to maybe get on the front side of it, try to get on the proactive side of it, I did what a lot of people I think do when they realize they have a problem. And I tried to run away from it. You know, whether it's through alcohol, whether it's through drugs. The big drug for me was food. I used to binge eat all day, every day in college. And next thing I know, I've gained over 70 pounds. I'm now 220 pounds. I'm like obese for the first time in my life, which makes things a lot worse. Sort of like my lifelong social anxiety transforms into social isolation. And then I really begin to develop like pretty like serious depression for like the first time in my life, which then eventually leads me to walking the path of being suicidal for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month of my life. And that's kind of where I hit a real rock bottom where, you know, it's not like, I was hit by thunder or like God came and talked to me and he was like, hey, you have to follow this plan. And it's not like I changed my life overnight, but it was just a small series of steps of like, you know, one, me having hope, me realizing that there is a future, me realizing that, you know, the past history of my life was not a prison for me of behavior that I have to constantly do, but just a reminder of a transformation where I could actually be the person who I've always wanted to be. And so honestly, like the first thing that I realized was, you know, when I was going through this, I had no idea again that this was happening. This lag of consciousness. I don't know if you've experienced this before, but oftentimes we process things and they hit us after. And so for me, the real thing that was immediate was the fact that I had gained weight.
Yeah.
And so I slowly began to tackle my health, exercise, food. Food was the big one. And that slowly began to put me on the path of understanding what health really was. And slowly but surely I began to, you know, add new habits. I began to speak with different people. I began to read different books. Eventually I began to like actually expose myself to social anxiety. And I would like do what they call exposure therapy of incrementally exposing yourself to different aspects that we can get into if you want to. But yeah, it was like all like these little different things that I had to do that, you know,
Yeah. So let's go back for a second, right? So you become to a point where you're like suicidal, right? And then did like some significant event happen to kind of trigger you to then work on your physical health, or did somebody interject, or what was there some event that happened where you started saying like, hey, I really need to start working on myself? And it sounds like it started with improving your physical health, which then improved your mental health, right? Is that right?
Yeah. So it's so honestly, like the thing about this is like, as someone who's hosted a podcast, like, and I've done like 500 episodes, you know, we want to think that stories are like A and then B and then C and then D and then E.
Yeah.
the matter of fact is there's so much more messier. So
Yeah.
when I kind of like had that moment of going to that party and realizing that I had social anxiety, at first what I did was I tried to expose myself to it right away. I tried to go outside and talk to random strangers, and it
Mm-hmm.
didn't work. And I actually got way more stressed. And I actually think that's what put me in a really depressed state, because I tried to tackle my problem, but it didn't work. And so I thought that I had no hope. And so, I mean, there were a few things that began to trigger. One was I listened to my very first podcast, and it was a podcast by Tim Ferriss. And he talked about when he was in college, he was suicidal. And so when I heard that, I was like, wait, I'm kind of going through the same thing. And yet I'm listening to a podcast by a guy who's talking about what I'm going through right now and the way that he's been able to climb out of that. And then now he's like someone who's doing a lot of great things in the world. That was one of them. And I think that slowly began to open my mind, but not really. And I think the other big one was like the way that I was trying to commit suicide was, so I lived in Boston, and I still do live in Boston. And Boston's a great place, but there are neighboring cities and neighborhoods, just like every place, that are not so great.
Yeah.
And I remember the place where I was going to college, and at that time, there was a neighboring city that was like a 2 streets down. And I remember like we would always get like text alerts from our college that was like, hey, don't go outside, there's been a shooting. Hey, don't go outside, there's been some gang violence, someone got mugged. And so literally what I would do is I would walk outside in the middle of the night, and I would just hope that someone would just walk up to me and try to mug me and kill me in those areas. And so a few different things happened. One, I did that for like 2-3 weeks. And I think the fact that I was so desperate, one, enabled me to realize that if I was doing something super scary, if I was doing something like walking in a terrible neighborhood at night, which is something that you should not do, to try to kill myself, maybe fear isn't that bad at all. Because like that sounds terrifying. Now when I think of that, I'm like, oh my God, like that's horrible.
Yeah.
But the other big thing that happened to me was I remember like taking these walks, and I remember this one night in particular, I wasn't on my phone. I wasn't listening to anything. There was nobody walking in the street. There were no cars. And I kind of heard like this eerie sense of silence. And I remember hearing that, and I just like looked around, and it was almost like it was kind of weird. It was like almost like not a scene out of a movie, but it was almost this time where I got so still inside of my head. I was so silent for the first time in my life, where there were no distractions, where I kind of felt like the real version of me that had always been there, but was always suppressed through the first 18 years of my life. You know, whether you call that intuition or whatever, I like slowly heard, not like voices. I didn't hear a voice, but slowly felt like very deep emotions arise, and they made me cry. And it was almost like, it was a weird feeling. It was almost as if like my mom kind of gave me a hug. Like it was that kind of like warm feeling. And I remember when that happened, I was like, wait, what the hell just happened? Because I had never experienced something like that at all. And when that happened, it not only kind of gave me hope, but it made me realize that, you know, if this thing just happened that I've never experienced, maybe there are other things out there in life that I just haven't experienced yet. But yet I'm trying to do this because I think I have all the answers, because I think that there are no other possible solutions left. And so when I slowly began to like have that experience happen, I remember running home. And I remember running home, coming into my dorm room and going to the bathroom and looking at myself in the mirror. I remember looking at making direct eye contact with myself in the mirror. And I was just like, wait, what just happened? And it was, I think, the first time where I was in the right now. I was in the present moment. And I was just like, wait, who am I? Why do I look like this now? Why are all these things changing? And I remember like, that was the first time where I like looked down and I looked at my pants and I was like, wait, why are my pants super tight around my legs? And it was actually when I realized the fact that I was overweight. And I think throughout this time, I was just caught in this constant like trance, so to speak, of being depressed, of binging, of watching Netflix for hours on end, for not being able to sleep, caught in this trance of my real mental health problems that eventually slowly began for me to get in the present moment and be like, oh my God, I'm overweight. Like, I don't even recognize myself anymore from the beginning of this year. And so when that happened, again, it's not like I was like, oh my God, I need to change my life. I got to make this plan. It was just like a small domino of like, hey, I should probably lose weight. And the really interesting part about that was, I mean, of course I began to research more about health, exercise, all this stuff. But the real thing that began to change was me understanding the power of nutrition and understanding the fact that, like, throughout my entire life, I had always just been told that, hey, if you eat too much food, then you'll gain weight. And that's all the utility that food has in our lives. It's just to keep us not hungry, basically, and to keep us alive. And when I began to like read books by neuroscientists, by people who went deep into nutrition, I began to realize that things that you put in your mouth are actually chemical signalers to other hormones and different receptors of your body that almost control all of our biological function, from how the neurotransmitters in our brain are firing to which brain chemicals are secreted, to really just sort of looking at the human as a hardware and a software standpoint of like, our software is like, it's the mindset, it's the thoughts in our brain. The hardware is whatever the software is running on. And so our mindset is our mind, and our mind is housed in a physical organ called the brain. And so for me, that was a major part of my journey because, and even, in my book and kind of knowing the things that I know now, I think mental health, to oversimplify it, can be broken down into two major like sides of the coin of like, one is, are you actually the person who you were designed to be? Like, are you actually living your true life? Are you not using your potential? Are you constantly lying to yourself? Are you not living in the truth? Do you have terrible people around you? And the other side of mental health is your biochemistry. What are your neurotransmitters like serotonin doing? How inflamed is your brain? Because that's been associated from things to insomnia to suicide. And so when you begin to look at a lot of these different factors, they can really begin to almost like paint a map that, it's not complete. It might not work for everybody, but there are like a lot of fundamentals that are universal about humans and how they work and how potential dysfunctions in our mental health can arise, whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult. And so it's really interesting.
Wow. I'm just like
just
blown away
unloaded
there.
My book.
Yeah. This is the free audio version of the book. So let's take a second. Okay. So that's incredible. So that moment where it was almost like you had a little taste of what your mind being quiet was like, right? And then that kind of like charged you into like making changes and researching and like just on this path of improving yourself to now try to help as many people as you can.
Yeah. And I think it's the fact that I was just in so much pain. And I think a big part of that was the fact that I was super desperate, and the fact that like, I think when it comes to suicide, it's a very big issue, and 850,000 people every year commit suicide. I think a big part of that is like, nobody wants to kill themselves. Right. But what happens is, based on what based on how you know how to deal with life, your coping skills, and then the amount of pain that you're in, that's just the solution that you're trying to do. And so for me, what had happened to got me to that point was not being able to sleep. And that was because I had already tried all the drugs. I had tried the alcohol. I had tried the Netflix. I had tried the food. And I think the real breaking point of somebody is when they're not able to sleep. And so the vices, the coping mechanisms that I had been using stopped working. And so I think I was in that desperate enough of a place where, like, luckily I thank God, and I look back today of the fact that I'm not a statistic, that I'm now sort of just taking my message of, very subjective things, and then also a lot of scientific things, and trying to bridge them together, because this is a real serious problem. And like, what really made me kind of like, get serious and vocal about this and write this book was the fact that like at the beginning of this conversation, I was telling you what it really means to be an introvert. And there are so many people who are facing this issue, but they are being like camouflaged, disguised under society's mainstream understanding of what it means to be an introvert. You know, society says that the person who is sitting alone at a library or at a cafeteria is doing so because he or she is an introvert and they like their solitude. And there's that could totally be true. I don't know. But there's also a percentage of people who are not doing that out of their own free will. They're doing that because they have social anxiety, and their brain and nervous system has literally been conditioned due to a mental health problem to not get them to talk to people, even though they could be pretty social. And the real thing that really made me write this book was when I was looking at the data, like what the American Association of Anxiety and Depression say around anxiety. They said that social anxiety is the most common form of anxiety in America and also in parts of the Middle East and Asia. And they found that out of all these anxiety conditions, social anxiety is the most correlated with substance abuse and social isolation, which are both unfortunately tightly correlated to suicide. And so when I began to look at society's sort of mainstream solutions to deal with these issues, it's like call the suicide hotline or go see a therapist or a doctor. And those can be great. But the thing is like mental health already has a big enough stigma around it for like the average person who faces a mental health problem. It's hard enough for them to talk about these things with a normal person. But for someone who has a mental health problem that is social anxiety, there's no way you're calling anybody. There's no way you're going to see a doctor. There's no way you're going to see a therapist. And so that was another like major reason of why I wrote this book of like, what if I could create like this simple guide that I could give to someone where they can begin to do these things by themselves and then slowly ease sort of the path, ease the runway for them to, if they do deem themselves to be that bad of a condition, go see a doctor, go see a therapist, call a suicide hotline. And so that was a major reason of why I've written the book of like, this is a major problem that nobody knows, because even if people do have this issue or they don't, a lot of people don't see it. Like I didn't know I had this issue for the first 18 years of my life, but yet it was controlling me. And like, there's this analogy of two goldfish in a bowl, in a fish bowl. And one goldfish says to the other one, hey, how's the temperature of the water? And one of the goldfish says, what's water? And so goldfish are surrounded by this water that is invisible, but yet if a fish tries to go above water, it can't, because it can't go above water. And so water, I think, is an analogy for anxiety or social anxiety, or anybody who grows up who has issues that are so constantly in front of their face that they eventually blend into the background and they become the wallpaper of their brain to where they don't even see them and they're not conscious of them, and they don't diagnose them. They don't realize them. And so that's a major sort of conscious, unconscious issue. So yeah, I know I just said a lot there too, but I'm going to keep doing that, but
no, go ahead. We'll take it. So it sounds like the book is like really a path to just, to help people that are struggling with these type of issues, that are maybe too scared to reach out for help, or maybe even unsure if they even have this or not, right? And it's some really practical things that they can start doing on their own to improve their mental health.
Yeah. So what I would say is this book is meant for two people. One, it's meant for those who would, probably define themselves in the bucket of like, I'm a little bit too introverted. I'm a little bit too shy, but I don't want to be shy anymore. I actually want to like be the person who I want to be. I want to talk to people. I want to express myself. That's who it's for. And then also, I've had entrepreneurs from David Meltzer to people who have had billion-dollar exits endorse my book and say that it's a solid blueprint for mental health in general, for entrepreneurs or people who face a up and down life cycle, which is really everyone. And so like it's specifically made for people who are shy, but I think it is like, I've had a lot of people who are extrovert, a lot of people who are not introverts, and they've said that this book has greatly helped them kind of understand conceptually what mental health is, and then how to take like those practical fundamental layers apart and integrate them into your own life. So that's like the two halves.
Okay, awesome. And I'm sure there's like different, obviously, spectrums of where people, kind of fit
Right.
in how much, this is a real issue for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me, how did you go from that place to, having a top 100 global podcast, best-selling author, super active on LinkedIn, and just like on this mission of like helping people?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so obviously like all change has to start from within, right? So
Mhm.
of course, like before I could do any of those things, I had to not go to war with myself, but I really had to, and this never ends. I really had to, and still have to,
Mhm.
constantly dig deep down at my psychology by learning from other way smarter people than me. Um, having like not a schedule, but having like a key set of habits, routines that I have to do every day that are great for your mental health, like sleeping for 7 to 8 hours, like
Mhm.
eating a healthy, unprocessed diet,
Mhm.
to exercising, to meditating, to, writing and journaling my thoughts down, to therapy, to a wide range of things. But when it comes to like kind of like the more professional side of like how I marketed and how I did this stuff, I think for me, the real domino for that was in 2016, somebody had told me about LinkedIn.
Mhm.
And I had always like had a LinkedIn because they made us make it in high school as like an online resume.
Yeah.
And I remember somebody told me that I think it was at the end of 2016 or the beginning of 2017, someone told me that LinkedIn has a content feed. And I had never knew that. And I was like, oh, wait, I thought it was just an online resume. And like at that time, video was just happening. Video was just becoming a thing on LinkedIn. Before then, you could never even post videos, which is so strange now. But I remember there was this challenge going on. There was this initiative
Mhm.
called the Let's Get Honest initiative. And it was basically like, hey, film a video of yourself talking about a problem that you have not been honest about or something that you want to be honest about. And so I was like already on my journey. I had already been tackling a lot of these issues in
Mhm.
my life. And I made this video. I was like, hey, I suffered from real social anxiety. I could never talk to people in my life. And now by doing X, Y, and Z, I'm now able to a much, much greater degree. And I remember I didn't really think twice about that video, but that was like the first video that I recorded on the internet and I
Mhm.
had put up. And it was about a pretty deep topic in general. And I remember after, previously in my life, like the only people that had known I was going through this were, my close friends, my family. And so when I put it up there in public and I began to like read the comments and people saying like, oh, you're super brave for talking about this. People were saying like, oh, no way. Like I'm going through the
Mhm.
same exact issue right now. I think what that began to do is it began to relieve just like a lot of shame, a lot of guilt
Mhm.
around like the stigma of talking about these things, of talking about your own life. And so when that happened, um, to be honest with you, I didn't really do anything about it. I just kind of left it there, didn't
Mhm.
post on LinkedIn again. And then it was all the way until the beginning of 2018 where I began to get serious about LinkedIn, where I began to really use LinkedIn as a tool alongside my podcast that
Mhm.
I had started. And then my podcast, Humans 2.0, the reason why I started that was because it had nothing to do with my business, with my brand, with marketing, nothing. There's no intention for me starting a podcast to promote stuff. For me, literally the number one goal was a pretty selfish goal. And it was basically like, hey, I'm still running into these problems that I don't know how to solve. How do I solve these problems? And I
Mhm.
had recalled of like, hey, if I want to solve these problems, I have to talk to not always, but I have to talk to the world's best experts, people that are actual practitioners, people that live and breathe this stuff for a living. They don't just talk about it. They don't just write about it. And so when I was thinking about that, I was like, how can I constantly get these people in front of me? Almost like creating like my own like education system. And so for me, that was the podcast. And so literally week after week after week, I would, when I got into meditation, I was like, who are the 10 best meditation experts in the world? Let me interview them. And that's really what it began to happen. And so like, if you look at my podcast, there are real like trends, I would say, of like where I was in my life, of what I was trying to tackle, from money to mental health to all these different various aspects. And for me, it was a real education system. And because of that, a lot of these people now, not all of them, I've been able to develop relationships with them. And some of them are my friends. Some people I hang out with. Some of them have become mentors. Some of them have become business partnerships. And so so the podcast has completely changed my life. And the podcast got popular through LinkedIn, through me using LinkedIn as a tool. I began to, break it down into 60-second micro clips. I began to talk about what I had learned on the podcast through LinkedIn. And then through that, by like towards the end of 2018, my podcast, was bringing on some big time guests. Apple had ranked it in the top 100. People had started to reach out to me to help them with various things. That's really like where my real like professional career kind of took off. And yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey ever since, but it's, step by step, and it's always a constant mission now.
Awesome. What an incredible story, man. We're going to take a quick second just to tell you a little bit about what we do here at Monster VoIP. We help companies save 30 to 50% off their current business phone bill and provide them more value and features than what they might have today. You can text us to learn more at 424-378-6966. Today, we're talking with Mark Metry, and we've talked about his journey from struggling with mental health to taking action to starting a podcast and getting super active on LinkedIn. And I want to kind of just wrap it up, telling us a little bit more about the journey of writing the book and the motivation behind the book, and maybe a little bit more for people that might be looking, for some help in this area and how the book might help them.
Yeah, definitely, man. So, so I mean, the real biggest things, of course, that I've already sort of mentioned is I kind of realized that this problem wasn't really being talked about. It's very much linked to suicide. But for me, I remember I got the idea to write this book last year when I was in LA for a speaking event. And I remember the day before that event, I couldn't fall asleep. And it's because I kept on coming up with this idea of screw being shy. And it was because like whenever somebody heard my story, whether it was like in person or on a podcast virtually like this, the number one like genuine question that I get asked is, hey, Mark, how do I, and like usually if someone would walk up to me, they'd be like, hey, Mark, thank you for coming. And I really liked your talk. And I could tell that they were super, super introverted, super shy. And they were literally used to be like the same person that I used to be. And they're like, how did you go from this person I couldn't talk to being a speaker? And so that was like the number one genuine piece of advice. Because I mean, people ask me for advice like, hey, what's the number one advice you tell to an entrepreneur? And so I get a lot of those, but that was like the number one genuine piece of advice or a question that I would get asked that I think would have real ramifications. And it's not like I can give that person like, hey, just do this, this, and that, and then he'll be good. Yeah. And so when I began to like kind of look at the market of books and other things that kind of exist for this, I saw a lot of books written by clinical psychologists, by doctors, by behavioral experts, by behavioral analysts. I think those are all great. And I'm friends with a lot of those people. And some of them have endorsed my book, but I think a major piece that's missing is just like the understanding to the average person that faces this issue that can't go through the scientific jargon. And so for me, I just wanted to make like this super simple, easy to read book that goes through not just like tips, not just practical things for how to do this, because I could have made my book of like hey, here are the most practical things to do this, and that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a major part of the book. But a big part of the book is understanding the root cause of this problem happening, the sort of science behind this, and like the real authenticity behind yourself and what living your own life actually looks like. And I remember last month, before this whole Corona thing happened, at the early March, I was in New York City with Jay Shetty, and he was telling me that he was super shy, and he was telling me that a lot of people are chasing like these tools. A lot of people are chasing the hacks, the tips, the practicality, and that's great and all, but it's like, if you don't know why you're doing that, why would you do that? Why would you be motivated enough to do that?
Right.
And so for me, that was a major part that I wanted to talk about in the book, and the real issues that I've gone through that people can relate to, whether it's overthinking, never being able to be myself in front of other people, suicide, substance abuse, all these different issues. And so for me, when I kind of took a look at the market for books and for solutions, I was like, something out there like this literally doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people that are suffering from this issue that don't have these solutions. And yeah, I mean, the writing the book itself was terrible. It was like one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. It was like running a marathon, where it's like, it's brutal, but it's very rewarding too, in the same sense after.
Yeah. And what better, source, right, for a book to come from somebody who struggled with these same things, right? Because I think that's like one of the biggest things, is people being able to identify that, hey, somebody else felt just like that. And like, here's a path of how they got out of it, It's
so important, man. The amount of emails and messages that I've gotten from people who have read the book, who are like, yo, I literally thought you were talking to me the entire time, and I thought nobody else went through these. That in and of itself is like a major win. And I think that is the first domino. Like, when you realize that this is not like some sort of a character flaw, or this is not like some unique thing about you. Unfortunately, this is like a real like scientific thing in your brain that many millions, I don't know if I can say billions, go through, that experience this, but just nobody talks about it because it's just not acceptable in our society. And it's slowly unfolding, slowly happening. But, I wanted to be on the forefront of that. So I think that in and of itself is major for someone to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just about out of time for today's show. Mark, thanks again for your investment today, and welcome to the Monster Chats community. Before we end it, tell us, how can people find you? Where can they get the book? What do you want to let people know?
Yeah, I want to let people know to not judge themselves, and to love themselves, and to go to Amazon or Barnes and Nobles and search Screw Being Shy, or just Google it, or look up my name. And if you go through these issues, or you have a kid or someone else who does, definitely read this book, because man, if like the 14-year-old version of me had this book, or even the 18-year-old version of me had this book, totally different story. But that's what I would say. And a good central spot to find all those things is just my website, just my first and last name.com. I'm sure you'll put a link in the description.
Yep.
Check out my podcast, social media. Feel free to get in touch with me. And Colin, thank you so much for having me on. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. If you're listening to the podcast, please subscribe, review, share. We're listening. We welcome your feedback. The show's all about you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Mark.
Woo!
Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Monster Chats, presented by Monster VoIP, where we share the tools, methods, and best practices that business leaders use to build new connections, strengthen relationships, and impact sales in organizations of all shapes and sizes. If you have any questions from today's show and want to reach us directly, please text your question to 424-378-6966.